Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the creative world. My name is Ryan, and in today's video, I'm going to give you guys a quick and dirty lighting and editing breakdown of the following image. To do this, I used a Sony Alpha 6500, a Sigma 35mm 1.4 lens, and 3 Yongnuo YN560 Mark IV Speedlites. My camera settings were ISO 160, f1.4, and 1/160 shutter speed. The first light was at 1/64th power, 105mm, with a blue gel shooting through a medium-sized beauty dish directly above my subject. The second and third lights were both at 1/16th power, 24mm, with red gels shooting through a medium-sized softbox on the ground aimed up at the backdrop. Here is what each light looks like individually. Here are all the lights together, and this is the final image. Since my seamless backdrop wasn't wide enough to fill my frame, I had to extend it. I did this by using the rectangular Marquee Selection tool, selecting a large portion vertically of the backdrop near the edge, and going up to Edit and selecting Content Aware Scale. This will bring up the transform controls on your selection. I simply dragged to the right to cover up what I needed. Following that, I used the patch tool to clean up any major dents in the paper behind my subject. Next, I went up to Filter and Liquify. Here, I used a large brush with a low density and pressure to make very subtle changes. A lot of people tend to go overboard with the Liquify tool, which is fine if that's what you mean to do. But for me, in this step, I like to make corrections to my subject's shape that could have been attained by more careful posing and camera angles. To clean up my backdrop even further, I used frequency separation. With the low frequency layer selected, I used a lasso tool with a large feathering and selected portions of my backdrop that had uneven coloring. I then applied a strong Gaussian blur. I repeated this until I had a smoother background. After that, I used dodge and burn to even out the backdrop even more. I first made a black and white adjustment layer so I can focus only on the values. I made a levels adjustment layer that darkened the image, and then I inverted that layer mask by selecting the layer mask and pressing Ctrl or Command and I. Using a large soft brush, I then painted white on that layer mask to darken the hot spots of my backdrop. I then created another levels adjustment layer that brightened the image, and again inverted that layer mask, and using a large soft brush, I painted white on that layer mask to brighten the darkest areas of my backdrop. Next, I cleaned up my subject using the frequency separation layers that I already created. With the high frequency layer selected, I used the spot healing brush tool to clean up any stray hairs and blemishes. With the low frequency layer selected, I then used the lasso tool, and with a low feather, I selected large portions of my subject. With those areas selected, I applied a Gaussian blur. Be careful on this step, as it's very easy to overblur these areas and it will end up looking very strange. Also be careful not to blur over areas of texture change, such as the edges of clothing touching the skin, or the eyes and other facial features. I then moved on to the dodge and burn phase. Here I created 2 curves adjustment layers, one that darkens the image and one that brightens the image. I then inverted the layer mask of both of those layers. Starting on the dodge layer, that's the layer that brightens, I used a soft brush and painted in white to selectively brighten parts of my image. On the burn layer, that's the layer that darkens, again used a soft brush and painted in white to selectively darken parts of my image. I used the same principles here as you would when shading a circle to make it look like a sphere. The goal here is to add depth. Once I was happy with how my subject was looking, I then moved on to add a bit of atmospherics. Here in this step, I added some embers to my image using my Fire Effects asset pack. If you're interested in getting these, you can check out the link down in the description below. With these assets, I simply dragged and dropped them right into my project. I changed the blending mode of those layers to screen. To enhance the embers a bit, I duplicated the ember layers and added a small blur. I repeated this process with some larger embers in the foreground and added an even greater blur. I realized my subject was a little darker than I liked. I opened up my subject layer in Camera Raw and created a large radial adjustment that increased the exposure a bit. Next was sharpening my image. To do this, with the top layer selected, I merged all visible layers into a new layer on top by holding Ctrl, Alt, Shift, and pressing E. If you're on a Mac, it's Command, Option, Shift, and E. I then set the blending mode of that layer to overlay. And then I went up to Filter, Other, and then High Pass Filter. Somewhere around a value of 3 pixels worked great for this image. To finalize the image, I moved on to the color toning phase. The first step was to again merge all visible layers into a new layer on top. I then opened that layer in Camera Raw by going up to Filter and selecting Camera Raw. Here I loaded up a preset that I made that is a combination of levels, curve, hue, and saturation adjustments, as well as adding some film grain. Feel free to pause the video to see my settings. In the last part of this phase, I created a color lookup adjustment layer and set the blending mode of that adjustment to color. And then I loaded up a lookup table, also called a LUT. Photoshop comes with a few by default, but you can find a lot of really good LUTs online, both paid and free.
Guys, thanks for watching. If you like this video, maybe give it a thumbs up. If you have any ideas for videos that you want me to make for you, let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing. And until next time, stay creative.